In this part, we come back again to this diagram that we studied firstly, was simple diffusion, then the diffusion through channel protein, then diffusion through carrier protein, which was facilitated one. Example was glut one. And then we have active transport now. So now what is active transport? It is the movement against the concentration gradient from an area of lesser concentration to an area of higher concentration, or against the concentration gradient, or an uphill movement. And as you know, whenever we move above an hill, we need certain energy, and this energy is in the form of ATP. And such a transportation is known as active transport. Now, active transport further has two types: primary active transport and secondary active transport. The primary active transport is the one in which the normal energy comes from ATP. But the secondary active transport is the one in which the normal active transport is providing energy for such a transportation. So the energy is coming from a secondary source and not directly from the ATP itself. So, a very good example of our primary active transport is the active transport of sodium and potassium. This is the sodium potassium ATPase pump. So now we have two sets of this pump. One is a bigger subunit, that is the alpha subunit. Other is the beta subunit. Alpha subunit has a weight of 100,000. Beta subunit has a weight of 55,000. On the exterior of this molecule, we have channels for the two potassium ions, and in the interior we have area for three sodium ions. As you know, sodium are more in number on the outside and potassium are more in number on the inside. So normal movement was of potassium was normally moving outside and sodium was normally moving inside. But in active transport, opposite of which happens, now sodium moves from the inside to the outside and potassium moves from the outside to the inside. Three sodium are moving out, two potassium are moving in. They use the energy in the form of ATP and they convert the phosphate energy, that is 12,000 calories, in this process. They are further stating that 60 to 70% of the cell's energy may be devoted only for the process of sodium and potassium transportation through the sodium potassium ATPase pump. The sodium potassium ATPase pump is very much important for controlling the cell volume. What actually happens is that if there was net movement of the ions on the interior, the water would follow the ions and the cell would swell and then burst. What happens that in this area we see that three ions are moving to the exterior, the two to the interior. So as a net result, we have exterior movement of the ions. So water will move from the interior to the exterior following those ions, and hence the cell would not swell up and not burst. This is the nature of the sodium potassium pump, or the role of sodium potassium pump in controlling the cell volume. Second is the electrogenic role of this pump. As we know, the interior of the cell membrane is negatively charged, exterior is positively charged, and if there was net movement of the ions to the interior would have become more positive. But what happens? We clearly see that the net diffusion is of one ion to the exterior. So the interior remains negatively charged and exterior remains positively charged because positive ions are moving towards the exterior. This is very much important for nerve and muscle fiber electrical impulse transmission. So next thing to be studied over here is primary active transport of calcium ions. And as we know that calcium ions are more on the exterior, let me show you what happens in this pump diagram. So this is a very nice diagram which actually shows that the calcium ions which are present in the interior of the cell, they are pumped out to the exterior via this cell membrane pump which uses ATP, or they are pumped to the interior of the sarcoplasmic reticulum via also a calcium ATPase pump. This pump is known as the SERCA, that is smooth endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase pump, or sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase pump. And these two pumps require energy in the form of ATP to maintain lower concentration on the inside of the cell and higher concentration in the extracellular fluid. Same thing occurs for hydrogen in the gastric glands of stomach and in the kidney tubules. What happens is that hydrogen ions, they are pumped by using ATP to the from the cells to the exterior to the lumen of the cells, as a result of which we can excrete hydrogen ions in our urine and get rid of the acidity in our body. So if we want to calculate the amount of the energy that is used in the movement or active transport, we can do it by using energy which comes in calories per osmol, 1400 log of C1, that is concentration on one side divided by the concentration on the other side, as a result of which we will get the energy that was used in the process of active transport of any of such ion that we are studying. Also, we see that in the renal tubules and glandular cells, these cells expend 90% of their total energy for the transportation, that is active transport, to maintain the amount of the calcium ions or hydrogen ions or sodium and potassium ions in their cell, to maintain their cell volume, to maintain their concentration, and to uh, get rid of the acidity from the body. Now, in the active transport, we have secondary active transport, which actually utilizes the energy which is coming from any other type of active transport or any other primary active transport that is happening side by side. Now, we have two types of secondary active transport. One is core transport, other is counter transport. Core transport is movement of two molecules onto the same side. Such molecules are supposed to be oppositely charged. For example, sodium and glucose. Sodium is positively charged, glucose is negatively charged. This glucose and sodium, both of them, they will attach to their binding sites and they will be pumped to the interior of the cell. This way, by using energy in the form of ATP, which is derived from some other reaction, because it is secondary active transport. Now we have counter transport, in which one molecule is moving to the exterior, other is moving to the interior, and the two ions in such a situation, they are same charge, like sodium and calcium, they are having same charge, or sodium and hydrogen, which are having same charge. As we studied in the previous diagram, that calcium moves from the interior to the exterior by using energy in the form of ATP. So sodium actually uses this energy passively, but in secondary form, and is transported to the interior. Same goes for hydrogen ions, in which we studied the primary active transport of hydrogen ions from the interior to the exterior in renal tubular cells, and this secondarily energy is used by the sodium to move itself to the interior of the cell. So, sodium in both of these situations is not using its own energy, rather, it is using the energy that was being utilized in some other process. One was the transport of calcium, and other was the transport of hydrogen ions. And in the co-transport mechanism, actually glucose was being transported to the interior to provide energy to the cell, but sodium also took advantage of this method and moved to the interior using the energy which was actually being used to transport glucose. So this is how secondary active transport takes place, by using energy that was actually being provided for some other process, but another ion took advantage of that energy and did its work. So this one occurs in renal and intestinal epithelial cells. This one, it occurs sodium calcium counter transport. It is very much important because it occurs in smooth muscle cells, and this is important because sodium hydrogen transport takes place in intestinal cells, renal epithelial cells, etc., late distal convoluted tubules, etc. Now, in certain cellular sheets, like in the intestinal epithelium, the renal tubular cells, exocrine glands, gallbladder, and choroid plexus of the brain, what happens is different processes are occurring simultaneously to move certain ions from one side to another side. For example, consider this brush border epithelium of the intestines. So, sodium moves from the brush border to the interior of the cell via diffusion. Now, it moves into the paracellular area via active transport. The water over here moves into the paracellular area via osmosis. And now both of these they move into the connective tissue via active transport. This is how the basic transportation across cellular sheets in intestinal cells, renal tubular cells, choroid plexus, and epithelium of gallbladder takes place. And these mechanisms are very much important for the transportation of all the nutrients, ions, and other substances into the blood from the intestines, as a result of which we get nutrition into the bloodstream. And this is how the mechanism of transportation takes place. Now I'll give you a very short summary. Simple diffusion was for the substances which were lipid soluble: oxygen, nitrogen, and alcohol, etc. Channel proteins, which were aquaporins, 13 different types. They were sodium channels, potassium channels, then they were voltage gated, they were ligand gated. Then facilitated diffusions, in which we studied the example of glucose transporter protein, 14 in number, most important glucose transporter 4 protein, which is insulin dependent. Then we had carrier proteins. Carrier proteins were really important because they were helping in active transport. So, active transport was the sodium potassium active transport. The other active transport was active transport of calcium ions, active transport of potassium, hydrogen ions. That was all primary active transport. Then we had another type of active transport, that was secondary one, in which we had counter transport and co transport. If you use this diagram and you know the examples, you are done with this chapter very easily. I hope you understood each and everything that I have taught in this chapter. See you soon again with new chapters. Till then, Allah Hafiz. And please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much.